What is it that binds us to this place as to no other? It is not the well or the bell or the stone.
Hi, I'm Susan King, and I'm the Dean of the school, and I want to welcome you here to the Charles Kuralt Learning Center. It's quite a place, and I hope you're going to look around. It's really a time capsule, a snapshot of one of America's great 20th century broadcast journalists, Charles Kuralt. And here you can find his books, and his pictures, and lots of his memorabilia, things that I think you'll find great and perhaps inspirational, including some amazing Emmys like this one. And as you might expect, there is a story behind this room.
Hi, I'm Richard Cole. I was fortunate enough to be dean when the Charles Kuralt Center was created. Charles and I had known each other for years, and we were friends. He used to love to come and visit the school and talk with students especially, visit with professors too. He had many friends at this university. He loved this university and our school. The idea for the center, the Charles Kuralt Center, didn't come about till after Charles died. But it was very soon thereafter. A lady by the name of Karen Beckers, who was Charles's executive assistant, and I talked about a tribute to Charles, and the idea arose about, well, what about his office? Would the school like to have his office? And that seemed to be a wonderful thing to do. It would inspire students. It would be a place where we could have meetings, special events, and so on. On a weekend, the moving van went up to New York City, where Charles's office was, of course, and the architects were there, and the movers were, and things were loaded up in the van and sent down here. And then once it got here, we couldn't reconfigure things exactly the way they were in his office because the shape of the room is a little different and so on. But we configured it as best we could. And in a way, I think Charles would have liked.
After the office was moved here to Chapel Hill, it was decided it really should be open so that visitors could come and feel that Kuralt spirit. Richard Cole immediately said, we need some docents who can really tell that Kuralt story. One of the longest serving docents is Lois Cranford.
The dean wrote to a number of people who are mostly dead now, but who were very active with the journalism school over the years, and invited us to a meeting to talk about being docents. And that was in about 1999. He died in 1997, and they set up this room in 1999, opened it toward the end of that year. And the dean wrote to us and wondered if we might like to be docents. And we were all admirers of Charles Kuralt, and the idea appealed to us, and so I became one of 8 or 10 docents back then. Well, you see, he went to Carolina. He did not graduate, and because he was the editor of the Tar Heel his senior year. He also had a bride because he had found out that it paid $30 a week, I think it was. And he calls his girl in Greensboro and says, you know, we could live on that, so let's get married. And they did. So he had a bride and a Tar Heel to put out, and over the course of the year, he dropped one subject and then another until first thing you know, he wasn't taking anything, but he's still editing the Tar Heel when everybody else graduated. So he did not. He had to leave the university for a quarter anyway. So he went to work for the Charlotte News, and the Charlotte News put him on doing some kinds of columns about interesting people doing unusual things. A little bit like what he made a career of. So he had a message to call CBS when he came home that day, and he knew that one of his friends was making fun of him, so he didn't do it right away. But when he did, sure enough, the answer was CBS, Columbia Broadcasting System. And he talked to him and arranged to go to New York then to be interviewed. And they hired him. He got into that in an interesting way. He was flying over America with one of his colleagues at night. And you look down and you see a city here and a little town here, and it's very pretty down there. And so he says, we're flying up here over it, and there's a good story in every one of those little towns. And we ought to be down there covering them. And the more they talked about it and thought about it, the more they liked the idea. And in next day or two or three, when he could, he talked to the president of CBS about doing this, taking a crew with him. He said, we can run a National Geographic bus that they're not using now, and travel all over and find stories. And he says, what do you think you're going to find down there? And he said, oh, I don't know. It might be kids jumping in a pile of leaves or swinging on a tire. It might be a fellow in Vermont who's tapping his maple sugar trees, or I don't know, but the stories are down there and I'd like to be down there covering them. So he said, well, we'll try it for a little while. You just keep your hand on the budget and see what you could do with it. Well, of course, maybe the first one wasn't the greatest success of all of them, but anyhow, he kept doing things that we like to see and hear, and we'd tune in to Walter Cronkite's news show, and it would be at the tail end of that. And it became something that America loved.
For me, there's a personal wonderment that Charles Kuralt's office is here, because I started my career at CBS News. I worked for Walter Cronkite. I was just a lowly correspondent for him. And I worked in what was called the dog pen. It's where all the sports staff were. And Charles Kuralt came there quite often. It was a really tough time. Vietnam was raging. We were doing stories that were rattling America. Cronkite was really a spokesman for a difficult time, and people trusted him. But it was that Charles Kuralt story that ended our broadcast every night that said, America is strong. Look at the stories of America on the road. Now to be the dean of the school where Charles Kuralt's office is, wow.
In my opinion, Charles was one of the best journalists the United States has ever produced. He was a broadcast journalist, obviously. He had this wonderful, deep, resonant voice that commanded attention. He could tell stories like virtually nobody else could. And that's what he liked to do. He was a storyteller. He liked the human part of journalism. He liked to tell people stories. The On the Road series lasted for years and was famous. He'd pick people who weren't necessarily, some of them were famous, some of them were not famous at all. He and his cameraman, Izzy, would drive that van, and they'd go on the byways out in the boonies of the United States and find people sitting on porches in rockers and get them to tell wonderful stories about themselves. He could coax wonderful journalistic stories out of people. Charles loved this university, and he loved to come down and talk to the students and faculty and people in general. He made, I don't know how many speeches here, sometimes at big important events, sometimes at just speaking to one class or speaking to groups of people. His brother owned the MEJO bookstore here in town for many years, Wally Kuralt, and Brenda, Wally's wife, of course, was here, and they were close to Charles, so Charles would come down and visit as well. One of the biggest speeches Charles ever gave at the university was on the occasion of the university's bicentennial, its 200th birthday.
Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President, Governor Hunt, Chancellor Hardin, I speak for all of us who could not afford to go to Duke would not have even if we could have afforded it. We are Tar Heels born and Tar Heels bred, and we are glad to be alive on the 200th anniversary of the establishment of public higher education in the New World, and immeasurably proud that this occurred October 12, 1793, here on the crest of New Hope Chapel Hill. What is it that binds us to this place as to no other? It is not the well or the bell or the stone walls or the crisp October nights or the memory of dogwoods blooming. Our loyalty is not only to William Richardson Davy, though we are proud of what he did 200 years ago today, nor even to Dean Smith, though we are proud of what he did last March. No, our love for this place is based on the fact that it is, as it was meant to be, the university of the people.
After he retired, he went to places, his favorite places, at the right time of year. So CBS never sent him those places at the right time of the year. And so he went to those places, and he started out in New Orleans for a month, and then he went to Key West for a month, and to Charleston for a month, and then he went home because a fellow that he had done a short subject on in Virginia, who raised daffodils for the New York market, maybe other flowers too, but anyhow, daffodils is what I know about, developed Charles Kuralt narcissus that was patented, and he had some bulbs from that, and he had planted them at the house they had in Connecticut, a little place they had in Connecticut. He had planted his bulbs, and he wanted to go up there and see them bloom.
Charles had lupus, and when he was dying, he wrote a letter on July 2, 1997, to Bill Friday, the former president of the UNC system here. He and Bill were very close friends and had been for years. Charles asked if there was any way that he could be buried on the UNC campus. He knew about the cemetery over there. And there aren't many spaces left in the cemetery, maybe none today. Even then, there were very few spaces left. But Bill, being the good person he was and such a good friend of Charles's, found somebody, a family that had a couple of spaces left, a couple of plots left. And so Bill was able to secure space for Charles and for Petey, Charles's wife. And then Charles died on July 4th, 2 days after he wrote the letter to Bill, and he's buried there now. And then after Petey died, she's buried next to him, of course. And the Charles Kuralt daffodil, the daffodil that's named for Charles, grows there and blooms every spring.
Well, time to say goodbye until our next trip together. We've heard about a story up the road here, but we kind of hope we never get there. With luck, we'll stumble upon something more interesting along the way. I can see the road is bending. Wonder what's around the bend.